and welcome to the Monopath podcast. Today I'm speaking with Ric Neale, who is my old music tutor from way back in college. So we've known each other for quite some time at this point. We didn't quite go into the detail of exactly how long that is, but long enough. Anyway, we speak about the relationship between talent, so musical skills that seem somewhat innate. I use the term felt sometimes, or intuitional. And comparing that against knowledge and developed intellectual skill, something that you would expect a teacher to have. And we kind of dance around these terms for a little while before getting into the writing process more in general. So some of the conversation gravitates toward writer's block and how to avoid it, and what the writing process itself entails. Ric uses terms like make and play state as an analogy for the two components available in writing music, where you're kind of more open to experience and open to novelty, and a closed state where it's a little bit more focused on what you've already got. I think of that in ways that I stumbled over my words a little bit about. I use the words longitudinal and latitudinal, or literal or lateral. I think of it as a cross almost, so left and right or up or down. Anyway, we get into those things throughout the podcast. Ric actually introduced a few ideas that I don't suppose I'd thought about them at all, or very much before. One thing he mentioned was the idea of variables, which I think when he's using the word, he's saying something about the ingredients of a piece of music. And I think that can be applied in some way to practically anything that a person creates. In this case, it's the instrument that one creates the music on, the space that it's written in, or the space that it's performed in, the person who creates it, and the audience. And so we do deal with each one of those elements. Just before we do get into the podcast, I should say something about the website, which is now officially launched. The first 6 podcasts I recorded were all done before that. And so much of the time that I was speaking in these introductions was fairly vague because I was unclear about what exactly I would have ready or available to listeners. Anyway, now at the time of recording this podcast, the website is launched. I'm thinking of doing something with Patreon or something similar. I still need to give that bit more thought. At the moment, it's still a little too fresh on my mind, so I'll sleep on that one. But there are costs to doing a podcast. It definitely costs me time and a lot of effort. I do enjoy it, so it's worth those costs. But there are also financial costs. One of the apps that I use to make the videos, for example, to produce the amount of videos at the frequency that I would like to produce them, incurs a charge, which is not entirely expensive. I think it works out roughly about £10 a month. And that's £10 a month I don't have at the moment. Things like microphones and preamps and stands, even microphone stands, these things costing me money, and I'm entirely happy to keep sinking money into doing something that I enjoy doing. So perhaps I should change subject. You can support the podcast in other ways that are equally valuable to me, in fact, which is simply by subscribing to the YouTube, by sharing the posts to others who you think might gain something from it. That's it. So, let's get on with it. Ric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Oh, good. Now, we have a lot of history, I think. We've probably known each other over a decade now.
That's a sobering thought, but yes, that's probably true.
Isn't it just?
Probably true.
Yeah, over a decade. I first met you probably in my late teens or early 20s at Leeds College of Music, doing a one-off workshop on songwriting.
I think you were definitely late teens at that point.
Yeah.
Which
long ago.
Yeah, it was long ago.
That's more than a decade.
It was a lot more than a decade, yeah. But I think we've aged like fine wine.
I haven't aged.
No, neither have I.
Just
great,
the same.
isn't it?
Just the same. It's perfect.
Boring.
With that history in mind, though, I have a list of things that I could possibly talk about, but one of them that I thought would be helpful to begin with was, with that context in mind, was about lecturing and teaching. So the question I have loosely is, what do you learn as a musician by being a teacher?
Well, I think there was a process when I first started teaching where I had to go through a sort of fairly weird process. This is a word I use all the time, but it doesn't exist, okay? Where I had to academicalize, not a word. I had to academicalize all the things that I'd done instinctively since I was the age that you were when we first met. Because even though I had quite a lot of theory under my belt, I'm a bit of a nerd in that way, I had to find ways of going, okay, well, why is it obvious to me that should go there? Or why is it so obvious that chord should come next? Yeah. So I went through quite a long process of academicalizing that. And I think that was really helpful because it made it clear what I was doing. It kind of took my instincts out of my head and put them in a different part of my head, or even on a PowerPoint, So it meant that I actively had the language to stop my instincts when I wanted to. Because if you always follow your instincts, you always do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So there's points where you have to put in, a wall. So you have to, so you have to go around it kind of thing. So I think in that way, it's definitely helped. I also think it helps because one of the things I do now is really more mentoring than lecturing. So I'm just dealing with one person and one song where they go, this is the song, I'm now stuck. What shall I do? And so being able to tinker with other people's songs and realize the benefit of that separation of getting outside help, it means I almost kind of write with one part of my head and then I mentor myself with another part, because you kind of, you separate the two parts of your brain out a little bit. And also, I think when you're working with really good people, and I'm fortunate, I do work with very good people and always have, there've always been students who are excellent. I do think it kind of G's you up. You get ideas where I might be working with you, for example, and you might do something in a song and I go, oh, that's interesting. And I'm sort of secretly just kind of filing it away back somewhere in my kind of that part of my brain where I go, not to steal, but just kind of go, oh, okay, well, that's just a cadence that I never use and that person uses it all the time. So why don't I use it? Is there a thing? Is there a way I can fit that into what I already do? So I do think there's quite a lot of benefits. It also means you're part of a larger community as well, which I think as a songwriter it can be a difficult thing because it can be quite a lonely thing. But knowing there's other people going through the same stuff, I do think makes it easier.
Yeah, part of why I ask is because I started teaching singing maybe about 3 years ago, which I don't do so much at the moment. I started teaching it 3 years ago, largely because I was getting to a point where I was pretty comfortable and pretty confident. And I thought I could help people progress in ways that I had already done, given some of the mistakes that I'd made. But in doing it, the thing I hadn't really anticipated was how much I would develop because of that, by being able to see somebody else making a mistake and drawing a connection between other people making the exact same mistake, and also the improvements that everyone collectively seems to make. It was almost as if it was just, there's the same sorts of things that you're going to do wrong if you're a singer.
Absolutely, yeah. And I also think there is an instinctive thing from people who don't teach, and I include myself in that before I started teaching, where there is this sense that it's almost like there's two parties involved in teaching, i.e. me, the wise Obi-Wan, who knows all, and the other person who is purely a receiver. And they are just there. I am just there to kind of empty my brain into theirs. And it's just, that is not how teaching works on any level. Like, even like, I'm homeschooling my kids at the moment. Like, and even that, it just doesn't work in that way. It is a relationship. And when you form bonds with people, be that through family or through friendship, like, I think that the just community of everyone trying to get better at music just means that it's not like, oh, I am being paid to teach you this. It's like, oh, you're stuck and I can help, so I'm gonna, and vice versa.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to go back to collaboration at some point. But just on the topic of teaching, what difference do you notice in the music that you would create? Say, if you do have these two different parts of your mind, the intuitive part and the teacher part, do they make different music?
This kind of idea of separating my brain is something that it's language I use a lot, not just when I'm talking about music to other people, but when I'm talking about music to myself. And I do think that within, there's a brilliant thing, that I was told, and I hope it's true, about Lego. Do you know this? There's a thing at the Lego headquarters, which is somewhere in mainland Europe.
I don't know.
Okay, there's in Lego HQ, right? And I love Lego. Okay, everyone loves Lego, right? Where they have a red room and a green room for all of their designers. Okay, and in the green room there is a rule that there's no planning. You just go in and you play. You specifically just put different shape blocks together in different ways, and you find things about combinations of colours that you find enjoyable, about certain shapes, about the intersection of two particular angles that you just love to muck around with. But as soon as you start going, oh, wait a minute, I'm trying to make a TIE fighter, that bit might work really well. That's not a green room thing. That's a red room thing. So you play in the green room, and as soon as that play gets to a state of, I am now going to begin to work out the application of this play, that's a red room thing. It's a separate part of the building. They even go out of one room and go into another. And I think that is a really beautiful kind of way of expressing how I feel about creativity, in that I don't think I ever write one piece of music in one of the rooms. I'm always taking things between the different rooms. So it might be that, because you kind of asked the question about, well, what's the difference between the music? Well, if I am in play state, that you described it as intuitive, but if I'm in my green room and I come up with just something I like on a piano, or it might be a little voice note that I've recorded of just like a melody that for whatever reason I'm just chewing on in my head while I'm out walking the dog or whatever. And then I will always shape that in a separate room. I'll always take it into the red room, because I don't think you can find the full potential and beauty of any green room idea unless it spends some time in the red room. Science and magic is the other way I express it. Yeah. I'm a big Star Trek fan, okay? Like a really sad Star Trek fan. And because knowing loads about bark theory just was not getting me laid enough as a teenager, right? So I'm a big Star Trek fan. And I think one of the reasons why I think this way is ultimately Star Trek is built on that dichotomy. You've got the incredibly intuitive green room, all emotion Kirk versus the incredibly red room, logic, teacher-based Spock. And it is that relationship that makes where all the tension comes from, but also all the resolution comes from.
Yeah, there's like a paradox, or there's two things that seem like they're opposites to one another. I actually think that's the most interesting thing about people in general, that we introduce this kind of paradox to things that animals can. Simpler animals don't do these things that we do. I'm not as hugely into Star Trek, although I do enjoy it and I grew up on it.
It's all right. I'm not judging you.
My parents loved Star Trek. I am a fan. I will go no further than that, I suppose. But we've been watching Lost
Oh, right, yeah.
So that's about 20 years
Man
old
of
now.
science, man of faith.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
exactly it. So it's the same dichotomy there, I think. Man of science, man of faith, religion versus science, objective versus subjective. I think there's even something I've spoken about on earlier podcasts. I'd been reading a book about the brain, and people often use the comparison of having two different hemispheres that do two different things. And it's a rough description of what the brain's actually doing, but
yeah.
one being a bit more artistic and having a broad focus on, or a lack of focus, I suppose, but a broader view of things. That's the right hemisphere. And then the left hemisphere having this very focused, analytical approach to grasping approach to things instead. But that is the same, I think, as the red room, green room. Also, the words that I used, which is almost intuitive and felt versus skills. So when I'm speaking about you being a teacher, I guess what I'm pointing to is the difference between Ric Neale when he was this kind of innate ability, if you like, or a talent. I suppose some people would say a talent, and a developed skill, and trying to see what the difference there. So to bring it back to the question, do you think is there a difference? Like what music has the purely talented and expressive felt Rick made, and what would the purely logical Spock like Rick? What music would he create? Would there be an obvious difference between the two, or is it even impossible?
I think it's impossible to separate the two. I do think that there is a thing in all creative things, and it's particularly you see it a lot in musicians, and I know there's a lot of musicians that really distrust anything Spock-like. So like the idea, like I know a lot of musicians very proudly go, "Oh yeah, I never had a lesson. Yeah, I've not got any grades, me. Yeah, and great, which is fine. I'm not criticizing people for not having grades. Go crazy, but I've not got any grades either. I should also add, I'm not proud of it. Like the idea that working something out, that having knowledge about something you would do instinctively, I do not think weakens it. I think it strengthens it.
Yeah,
because actually. I suppose what I think, having done this for a long time, is that sort of that kind of green room version of myself that is entirely going on intuition and that felt stuff, as you say, just keeps writing the same song. That's the thing. And so really it needs a bit of red room to put it into a different angle. Now, I think that for the first few years of writing, you're fine doing that. But, I'm 45 at the end of this summer. I've been doing this a long time. And I can't just keep going back to the same well. And that is an academic problem. That is not an emotional problem.
Yeah. Do you think that has anything to do with why so many young artists burn out at some point or can't get past album number 1?
100%. Yes, I absolutely do. I also think there is a big difference, and again, this is a very languagey way of expressing it, but there's a big difference between people, so we're talking about songwriting, but between people who like to write songs and people who like to have written songs. And that is a very small difference in a sentence, but it is a massive difference. I love writing songs. The end game of that is, yes, I have a lot of songs, but I know a lot of people who hate writing songs, really, but they love having written them. Yeah?
Okay.
So the fact that they've done it is like, oh, thank God, now I'm a genius. But for me, like the bit I think that, and I know this more because I've worked with a lot of other songwriters, is they hate, there's like, oh, we can't get that line. And I'm like, oh, great. We can't get that line. This is going to be amazing when we solve this problem, So yeah, I think it's different. For me, it fits in the same part of my brain as why people do crosswords. I like the puzzle of it, and I don't think a lot of other people do. And so I think a lot of people. So you kind of made that reference about kind of younger artists. I do think there's that part who go, yeah, anyway, come on, let's write the song because then we get to gig it, right? Whereas I think actually love of craft is the thing that makes the big difference. You look at that in sport. You look at it in other creative industries. You look at it with like things like dance, okay, or even acting. But so my wife is a dancer, and I've done a lot of work in that kind of realm on some of the theatre stuff that I've done, and just their attention, their love of craft is something that us musicians are really poor at, like really, really poor at. Just even on the simple fundamental level of going, well, I want to do a show in an hour. So for between now and then, I've got to do my warm-ups, my stretches. I've got to get my breathing right. Like, there's just an appreciation of craft that is a daily thing. It's not like, oh, I've got a gig tonight, right? I suppose I'd probably better not smoke this afternoon. You know, it's a slightly different level of respect, I suppose. So yeah, it's slightly different, I think.
Well, I would say craft does imply skill as well.
Yeah, definitely.
I wonder how many people use their inability or their lack of knowledge or skill as a shield, rather than like, I'm glad you used words like puzzle and problem, because I think that's how I go into it. And so me developing the skills, they're just extra tools that can help me solve problems that I wouldn't be able to do without it. So it just makes all the more sense that I should go and study advanced music theory or teach or whatever it might be, whatever happens to be the case. I mean, I recently went back into education a few years ago to study philosophy, and that's the same kind of thing. I wanted to get better at speaking and writing and being able to communicate.
But also, like, I would say that I bet part of that for you was now you have a greater ability. It's not necessarily changed the way you think, although I bet it has changed it in some way, but actually your ability to understand what you were instinctively thought anyway is the bit that really changes at that point. So again, it's this idea of it's a little bit red room, a little bit green room, isn't it?
It's an augmentation. It's not a modulation. It's like something on top. So that's exactly how I think about it, though. And I mean, we have spoken about the make and play states before. So again, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think the last time you were around at my house and we were talking about one of the songs that I play, and I was saying that every time I perform the song, it's a little bit different. There's something, there's some glue there to it, and there's things I know roughly what the structure is going to be like, but say things like how long one section will be, or the exact chord that I play, or the inversion that I play, or the way that I sing it that's gonna change every single time. So how much of do you ever experience that in your live performance? Is it different?
Yeah, it's very different. I think I suppose I consider live performance really to be almost entirely, well, it's probably more play state than it is anything else, in that one of the things that I love about performing on my own is that I can kind of go anywhere. And like that stuff you make reference to of going, oh, okay, well, that section could work better if I do it that way. But I think also it comes from being a piano player, and every piano is different. So it's not like I can just get my guitar out of my case and it's going to be the same everywhere. There's some pianos that just are particularly more expressive in particular rooms than in other rooms. Right. Examples being like sometimes if I'm playing like, so you've seen me down at the Jolly Tap at the residency I have there. That piano has got a really bright middle, but it's not got much cut at the top end. Whereas I'll do other gigs. I did one at the Ric Neale. I did a show there on their piano, and it didn't have much in the middle, but the top end was really expressive. So in the like about a song in, you're going, oh, okay, I need to find that up there in this room, but I wouldn't have had to do that in other places. So that is a kind of mixture of play and academic, I suppose, isn't it? Because I'm using a lot of knowledge there, but essentially I'm trying to get the same thing in different rooms. But also, I think the difference between song and performance, like I think my reference points for songwriting and performance are just so old. And I don't mean even beyond my ridiculous antique age, you know. But like the music that made me love music is all of it's Cole Porter, it's George Gershwin, you know, and the understanding that those songs are made out of such solid brick that, you know, Sinatra can do it, Miles Davis can do it, Ella Fitzgerald can do it, and it's still recognizable. They're all playing with something that is incredibly rock solid, so solid that it can afford to be bent around.
It's almost, I use the term to honor the instrument when I play on a different instrument, but really I guess what I'm saying is something about the influence of a new medium on something that is the same. So in this case, or in my case, I suppose it's easier to talk about with that particular song, Hound on the Hunt. There's the medium of the piano and the medium of my voice, and the voice doesn't change all that much, but the piano does. Or if I play it on guitar, it changes again. But I can pick up different guitars and put them in different tunings, in different keys, and that I have to honor that. And I actually feel like I get stuck almost. Like I have to honor the instrument. It feels I'm repelled against not doing it. So if I pick up a guitar, I just can't play the song exactly the same as the recorded version. It just feels so wrong
Yeah.
to do that. It jars with me, and I feel almost a sense of guilt for doing it.
Well, a really weird experience I had a few years ago, I was very fortunate to get asked to do a house gig in London, in Shoreditch, by this guy who'd seen me play at another show, and he said, "Oh, I'll come play, why don't you come do a gig in my house?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, whatever." And then I saw some pictures of his house and was like, "Oh, okay." And he was an incredibly wealthy man who had this beautiful loft apartment. And I went and did a show there, and he had a Steinway, like the best like piano you can get, like a full grand. It was worth more than the house from which I currently speak to you by quite a distance, I might add. And it was really bizarre because essentially every part of the instrument, like there's nothing you could do that wouldn't honor it. Because every element of it was so perfect. I actually found it weirdly sort of paralyzing in that normally you're going, "Oh, where's the good bit?" It's like, "Oh, it's all good."
Okay.
It was a really strange thing of you're constantly trying to find, all right, where's the real juice? Where's the good vein in this piano? I'm going to find it. But everything was just gorgeous. It was really unusual. It was a nice problem to have,
Yeah, totally. I remember practically every instrument I've learned on dreadful instruments themselves. The guitar, I learned on a guitar on a 3/4 sized acoustic guitar that probably cost about £30 from Argos. And the action on the strings was, it felt miles away from the fretboard. So to hold them down took a serious strain on your fingers, like to the bone almost.
You have to really want it though, yeah? You have to really want it in those situations, which I think is quite nice,
And it does make it easy when you come to play on an instrument that is a bit better. I have to admit, I don't think I've ever played on an instrument that's felt so good that I can't do wrong.
Yeah.
I guess all I'm really pointing to there is that there's a virtue of having a terrible instrument because you have to fill the gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, honor the instrument, I think that's a really good expression. I'm doing so as I speak to you now, I don't know when anyone's going to be listening to this, but we are in the midst of the COVID-19 lockdown. So I'm obviously not gigging. I have 2 young children, so there's only sort of so much creative stuff I can do. But I had lots of plans for things I was going to do this year, but I kind of put them all on hold and thought, right, well, I'm at home, so I could do something interesting with the piano I have here. Now, the piano I have here it's not great. It's great for writing on, and it's very expressive, but I've got about 4 or 5 songs that I'm in the midst of recording that I recorded on that piano, but the songs are written for that piano. I could do them on another piano, but it wouldn't work as well. And it's trying to find the strength out of the weakness, isn't it? It's trying to find what is it that I can only do on this piano, and what is it that this piano is better at, than that dude's Steinway. Because there are some things, like when a piano sounds that perfect, it's very difficult to play a low status character, for example, in a song. When the piano sounds like a bleeding, sounds like an orchestra, whereas it's pretty easy to play low status on my piano because it's a bit shonky, So writing for that instrument is quite an interesting, it's another variable, and I like variables, like they're good.
Yeah, I like that you use the word character. You seem to be ahead of me on good words here. But character, I think the idea of it being a character in a piece of music or art, whatever the art form happens to be, and the things that you're using in it are like characters in it. And I would imagine that I would feel if I played on the perfect instrument, whatever that would be, that there would be something almost disquieting about it. Because, as you say, I think I do the same thing, and I try to find the thing about it, and that's there is a conversation going on all the time between me and the environment or the situation I find myself in. So I think that kind of influences how green or red room I happen to
Yeah.
be in any given moment. If I pick up a different instrument, it kind of steers me one way or
But there are,
another.
but also, I mean, there's a bigger variable that we've not really talked about yet, and that is the people, the humans in the room.
Okay.
And so even in a scenario when you're playing the perfect instrument, you're still having to do all of that kind of back office planning of going, right, I'll do this next, because if I tell that story now, it'll get a bigger laugh than when it would if I'd done it there. And if I go there, then I'll push harder on the pathos if I start that one slower and sadder, you know? So you're always playing around with those kind of variables, irrelevant of the instrument.
Yeah.
Because that's another variable to be understood and factored
Yeah,
in.
let's talk about that then, because you actually coaxed me back into performing live
Whether you wanted
tail
to
end
or
of
not.
last year. Yeah, but I fell for it, and I gained something that I'd forgotten I would, and I knew I would, which is that interaction. And I still feel the same thing when you, I suppose, when you perform in front of somebody, it's an extra thing, as you say, that you gain from it, which is that instantaneous feedback of what somebody's eyes are doing when you're performing. So where people are looking and how quiet people are is usually a good measure for me. Uh, do you find that live performance and do you feel like live performance is adding something to the final product of a song before you record and make it finished?
um, I would say, I mean, the way, I don't know how much people know about the music I make, or indeed you make, as people listen to this, but my recording process is pretty different to yours. In that, I think I had a realization about 6 or 7 years ago that actually performance is the whole thing. I like
Mm.
records that sound great, but I love records where time has passed, like an actual record of an event. I made
Yeah.
reference to Sinatra earlier on, and that's the records that I loved when I was a kid, because it's just some humans in a room, and time is passing for them at the same speed as it is for me as a listener.
Mm.
And there are variables that are being kind of bounced off in that way. And I just come out the back of working with the Housekeeping Society, which was a band, and it was a lot of it worked to click track for all kinds of complicated reasons, and it was great. But there was no kind of, oh, and now I could just do this, because there's other people and there's things that are already set in stone. So when I first did my first record as me and the piano, which was All That Counts, which was like 6 years ago, I think, something like that. Like, I was kind of, okay, I don't want to make a record. I want to record a performance, which is a very
Right.
different thing. So essentially, it was loads of mics around a piano and me desperately trying to play it right. As opposed to, well, let's find a perfect drum sound and build it that way, blah, 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 blah. So essentially, performance was boiled into these songs. It was baked in, you know?
Mm.
And so when I do them live, I just have to take certain elements of that and multiply them, you know, or divide them, depending, you know.
Mm.
Sadder songs become sadder, triumphant songs become more triumphant, depending on the instrument that I'm working with. So it's not adding something for me. It's kind of really, if you came to see, like when you saw me support you when we were down at the Jolly Tap that night, essentially you're just seeing me back in the recording studio. It's just we're not
Mm.
having to record it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I wanted to get to the recording process because I did know it was quite different from mine. I mean, I suppose I'll make it clear what mine is like at the moment with Arthur Dove. It's very glossy. So we spend a lot of time from the bottom up. There's a lot of vocal samples. So there's a lot of vocal samples and unusual stuff going on there. It tends to not be acoustic kits at the moment, but I think the end product is quite produced. So that is the polar opposite. And so I view it, or I have viewed it. I'm open to change on this, and I feel like I have changed a little bit over the last few years. But I had thought that the record was the final statement, the final word on what it is I'm trying to say with that song. And I think since I made the Arthur Dove record, so the 3 songs that I've released so far as Arthur Dove, kind of changed my mind when I started performing again, because I felt that there was more to say with it, which is why I ended up doing things with tea that tastes like the songs and reinventing them so much when I play them live. I think there was just so much more to do with the song, or with, I guess it's because partly I don't think of them as songs so much as I just think of them as these kind of really rough, vague ideas or concepts that you can just talk about in any number of ways. And a song is one way, recorded, and then a performance live is another, on a different instrument
Yeah.
is another, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's that idea of it's not the version of the song, it's a version of the song. And I
Yeah.
think, like, I like it when artists are constantly, I think most audiences hate it, but I really like it when artists continually reinvent their own versions of the song because they're changing, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing that I also try to do, kind of as best as I can, depending on my mood, the song that's come before it, the people that are there, the instrument I'm playing it on. You know, there's all kinds of variables to consider. One of the things I like about having done it for a long time, and there's not many, is that I've got a lot of songs. So essentially, I have a bit of a rule that I don't work out my set list until I've done a sound check. Because I like to sit in the room I'm going to play, usually with a cup of peppermint and licorice tea, Darren, and work out what my set list is going to be. Sometimes I've got some things like nailed on and earmarked that I'll definitely try that one. But yeah, so because I've got a lot of things to pick from, I kind of don't have to constantly reinvent the same song, which I think when I was earlier in my, what I might laughably refer to as my career, and I had less songs, essentially, well, I'm playing those 5. Let's hope no one hates me, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas now I can afford to. I'm not as driven by that, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny. I've migrated in that way as well. I remember being in bands only 5 years ago or something like that, where there was a set and that was it. And the set had a structure and it flowed a certain way and it worked. But like, this is the finished product. Here you are. We are now playing through it. And it was the same each time. Whereas now I do more or less the same thing. I haven't really thought about why I do that or made that decision, but I tend to have songs and turn up and then order them a little differently depending on the thing. I've heard a thing with comedians doing something of that nature as well. I don't remember the particular comedians, although I think Ricky Gervais is one of them, where they were having a conversation about whether to sound check or not and what the value of doing that is. The value being for some that you get a feel of the room that you're in. Whereas just said it was just unnecessary and it was superfluous. It had no gain at all. But the ones who did do that were kind of standing by the claim that it adds something that you couldn't do before you were there.
Yeah, I think it's definitely that. I would also say there's a big difference because if I was Aerosmith, I wouldn't do that because essentially I'm playing in the same aircraft hangar at different parts of the world with the same sound guys, the same in-ear monitors. So you're not even getting to the actual bounce of the room. You know, you're just getting your own thing back. So I think for someone like Ricky Gervais, I can see why he'd say that because really he wasn't a stand-up. Like his like first stand-up shows were at like Wembley, you know. So you're not getting that. Whereas I think when you're in a smaller venue, it's much more. I guess there's more variables, aren't there? It's you go to most concert venues now. And they are actively bland places. They are kind of a blank canvas upon which anyone can paint. Therefore, you can see Ricky Gervais there one night, and you can see The Cure there the next night. You know, so it kind of works in I guess it's a blander space, so they can fill it with themselves more easily. Whereas you look at places like the Grand Ole Opry, or places like the Brood for example, which are incredibly characterful. There's a bit more interplay. So yeah, until I start playing Wembley, I don't think that's going to be a problem.
It's an odd thing as well, actually. I'd never really given it any thought at all before. But I wonder if there's the natural inclination built into the system of any creative industry that moves you towards being more orderly and a bit chaotic when it's younger. So what I mean is that when you're an up-and-coming musician, let's say, you're more likely to play in these characterful venues. You're less likely to have sort of skills. And as your career progresses and you get older and you learn new things, develop these skills, playing bigger venues if the career is going well, then these are all of the sorts of things that actually are more likely to make the art that you perform, like Aerosmith, the same. across the board because you're playing in the same venue on the same aircraft hangar with the same songs, with the same team. You have the same skills. I just wonder if there's a kind of unhealthy direction that we're naturally being coaxed towards that you're resisting.
You look at the artists who continue to who we respect for constantly changing things, and they've always kind of thrown it out, haven't they? There's a point where there's I am throwing out both the baby and the bathwater because this is too comfortable, so I'm going somewhere else now. And I think there's a lot of creative people who do think that way because you just can't maintain just safely banging out the hits. You look at the likes of Bowie. He didn't play the hits for years. It was like, wow, he's actually doing Starman again. It was a massive deal when he did that. Then that pretty much he did that right until the end. Then he just had like sort of 20 years off doing it. Same for McCartney. And then wider you've got people like Elvis Costello who were like, well, I'm not even going to use the same instruments. Like now I'm going to do a record just with a string quartet or something. Just to constantly dip your toe into these other kind of performance spaces.
Yeah, it reminds me of a scene from Step Brothers where they're talking about Billy Joel, or there's a Billy Joel cover band there, and they're saying, "Play We Didn't Start the Fire." They go, "No, we're not doing that era," and just the fury that was met with.
Yeah, they were just doing Innocent Man era Billy Joel, is what it was. Yeah. It was that.
Same sort of thing. People do get more conservative as they get older because it becomes harder to change or respond to something external to you. I think I find that it's easier for me to just get stuck in my ways and go, I know what I like this instrument, I like doing this thing, it works, I'll just carry on doing that. Whereas it's quite difficult to change.
Change is always difficult, and I think, but it's sort of the deal. I think it's difficult because at the same time as us kind of almost sort of slyly criticizing Aerosmith, which is, I don't know where this came from, but it did. At the same time, if my cousin bought tickets to see Aerosmith and they didn't play Don't Want to Miss a Thing in exactly the same way as it was on the record, then they would be furious. And frankly, rightly so. So I don't think it's just about the artists kind of going down this path that makes them safer. Ultimately, there is more to lose. Essentially, you get to a point where people go, I want to play the hits. And even the thing that I find is really interesting when you kind of go, like you made reference to kind of when bands are younger, seeing them in all these characterful venues. Well, I bet there's a few people who saw Aerosmith in those characterful venues in the 70s and 80s when they were coming up, who still go and see them now in the O2, but they'd never in a million years go to those characterful venues now because they're for teenagers. The floor is sticky, the beer's horrible, there's no food, the toilets are minging. So it's up. Like, yeah, exactly. Do the hover, So it's I think I do think it is difficult for an established artist to continue to reinvent, especially now, I think, when there's less opportunities to do it.
Yeah, it does make me feel more and more that there's just a series of bad market incentives for artists.
Bad for everyone who's not making money, though, isn't it? Like, because financially, these are great choices, just not artistically.
Yeah, totally. I'm so interested in something novel that I can't get stuck, which is sometimes infuriating because it means I don't finish things. I'm almost like a dog chasing his tail. I'm always spinning around looking for something new to try, which means my music has changed quite a lot from when I was young, when it was heavy, really. It was like quite heavy rock music to being now when it's this glossy pop stuff. I thought we could talk about maybe your progression. We've kind of flirted with this idea a little bit of the different rooms and between intuitions and analysis and these different halves of brain. But when you were younger, am I right in saying that your music was a little bit different to what it is now as well?
Not massively. I mean, so I guess to give a sort of mild potted history, I didn't have piano lessons and stuff when I was a kid. I sort of came to it relatively late for someone who's self-taught. I didn't really start till I was about 13, 12 or 13. And I just got a little keyboard. And then I kind of graduated from that to the piano and really loved it. And really the stuff I first started playing live was with a big band. Our school had a really good big band. And so that was like, there were sort of 25 musicians in a room. A lot of whom were really terrible, but it was like, including me at that point, I should add. But that's where I really fell in love with playing music with other people. And so that's just a more complicated form of music than most. You can't like read tab for, if Ella Fitzgerald covers, it doesn't really work. So, that idea of instruments working together and having to arrange and having to have kind of technical nous and proper kind of storytelling and melody within songs rather than sound, if that makes sense, was kind of where I started. And then from that, I really got into the Beach Boys because that is as close as pop music comes to that stuff, i.e. very complicated arrangements, hugely dense, and then from that I sort of pivoted into kind of singer-songwriter stuff. And so my first couple of albums were like guitar, bass, drums, still acoustic. It wasn't that different to what I do now, I suppose. It was a bit more Neil Finney, I guess, for want of a better example. And then off the back of that, I did a few albums of that, then did the Housekeeping Society, and that was with two other musicians, Spencer Bales and Ivan Mack. And we did a few albums that were all quite concept-y, and we used a lot of found sounds, and we did an album about the British seaside, for example, and lots of those kind of things. And then I started doing what I now do, which is almost entirely just piano and voice, from a performance point of view, but the last few records I've done, I've started to invite more people onto it. So it's not changed that much. In fact, I would say that what I do now is more similar to what I did when I first started than anything that's happened in between.
So you've almost gone full circle.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess. Just better.
Or spiraler, like a helter skelter.
Yeah.
That kind of evokes the right imagery for me. I have to ask this question. It's about ownership of the songs, and I'm not really talking about copyright or any of these things. I'm talking about your view on, given your view of the role of an audience and playing live, and you writing the music and different instruments. It's like who has ownership of it? I guess if that may not be totally clear, but I could probably add that when you're playing live music in front of somebody, does the opinion of the audience, like, does their view of I like this or not, does that mean something? Like, do they have ownership of the song in a way?
It means something, but it doesn't mean everything, I would say. Like, I don't think if I do a show and people don't pay attention, I'm not one of those sort of self-flagellating, why do I bother kind of, I just sort of think there's kind of no point. In terms of ownership, I think it is very difficult for ownership to be anything other than mine. And the reason, not that I demand it to be mine, I would absolutely, like the times when there's things I really love, like I've played at a few people's weddings and I've played like my own songs in those kind of situations. I should add almost none of them are still married. But like things like that are amazing. Like things like a friend of mine who I'd not seen for years, like for donkey's years, got married they were somewhere very glamorous, like Monaco or something. And he sent me a video of that his brother had taken of his wife walking up the aisle. The song that they'd chosen for to walk the aisle was Together, which is one of my songs. They'd never seen me play live. So in terms of that ownership, like he's not seen me for 20 years, probably more. So that ownership is kind of pretty much, then it's on them. But the problem with those kind of things is if he hadn't known me 20 years ago, I'd have never heard that song. And actually, that idea of the people owning this, like when people sing songs back, that kind of stuff, usually it's because of factors that aren't really in the artist's control, which is why record companies work so hard to try and get their songs placed in films, as soundtracks, or as title themes in TV shows. Because at that point, there is a wider sense of the song's function, which takes it beyond the artist. I tried to do it when I did Lullabies for Parents, which is a record I made a couple of years ago, which was all songs about parenting, because I've got two kids, and all the songs about parenting that I'd come across were less than useful. They were like the opposite. They were actually damaging, frankly. And I kind of wanted to write something. I think people kind of think it's just me moaning, and it's really not. But it is a staring out of the window, how am I going to do this kind of record. There's a lot of joy in it as well, but that is the main beat that I felt like no one else had kind of done. And really, I suppose I did it because I was sort of trying to pursue a level of truth in where I'm at in my existence. I think it's my job to an extent to try and put that into the art form that I choose. But also because I sort of was really excited about the function of it. And it's the first thing I'd made where I thought, right, a parent comes downstairs from getting the kids to bed and pours a glass of wine. And that is when this album happens. And so it was a real attempt to try and pass on that ownership to the audience. It is very difficult to do that when you're trying to engage with an audience who don't really go out live and probably only buy a couple of albums a year, and both of them are Michael Bublé's Christmas album. So that, that makes it difficult. But I guess I'm very aware of it, and I would love to pass ownership on, but there are factors that are beyond my control.
Yeah, I guess I had in mind the individual at the Aerosmith concert feeling nostalgic about the same song he's heard 1,000 times when I asked that question. But it could lead us two ways. One way is I'd like to know more about your view of function. I like that, what the point is of music in the first place. But before we do that, I wondered if you could say more about the distinction between art and an artist. Because there's sometimes, certainly not implying this is the case with either of us, but there's certain controversies with artists these days where we end up finding out they've done something fairly repugnant at some point in their past, and that is often used for some to say, okay, well, now we shouldn't listen to that music anymore. That should be forbidden music. Do you think the art and the artist are that close, or is there a bigger gap between them?
I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I do struggle with a little bit, just in my own sort of personal politics of kind of going, well, should I listen to that? Like, certainly when at the time I'm really aware of it is, for example, like I used to use a few Michael Jackson songs as examples in lectures that I'd give like all over the world. And then did go, I can't do that anymore, because I just think it's changed. I would argue, and so to kind of reverse out of that before I pull back into the space, I would say that the reason why people love the songs they love are almost entirely not to do with the songs themselves. The reason why people like the music they like is because of external factors. They don't go, oh, I love that because of that Mixolydian mode. Like, that's not what happens. The song's got to be good, but that is why when you look at all the most successful songs of all time, none of them are there for musical reasons. They're good, but you look at something like Candle in the Wind as a great example, okay? The reason why that sold the way that it did after Princess Diana died is people attached it to an external factor, and I think that is the same. You look at, Band-Aid was exactly the same, another hugely successful record. You start looking through those kind of top 10 best-selling records of all time, and not a single one is there because it's dead good. It happens to be dead good, but that's not why it's there. Yeah. So I guess if we're saying that the noise around a song is one of the judgment calls we use to decide whether we want to listen to it or not, we can't then remove that noise if it's bad noise. Michael Jackson being a great example, because like one of the things that, I'm a fair bit older than you, and like one of the things that was the deal with Michael Jackson when he was kind of first exploding, like, so when it was like, the mid 80s, and like I remember Bad coming out, like, and it was amazing. And one of the reasons why people were so fascinated with him was because he was basically like an alien. Like the stories that came out about this kind of bizarre sort of character who locked himself away and lived with a monkey and just essentially moonwalked from room to room, like this baffling kind of character is one of the things that made the music so exciting. It was like, who even is this? So we don't get to now, given what we now know, we don't get to just kind of go, oh, well, that doesn't matter because it's a great song. So I do think it makes it, I wouldn't feel guilty listening to Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, like, because it's a brilliant record. But at the same time, I probably wouldn't put it on my kids' disco playlist.
Yeah.
You kind of can't have it both ways. I think it's difficult.
Yeah, I totally get that. I've not heard that view before, but it's quite interesting, especially the idea of being cultural noise that you impose on something music. It's almost if you're treating the music itself as this subjective, static thing and imposing yourself on it. It's probably like your emotions that are going onto it, really. Is what story are you telling yourself when you hear a piece of music for the first time? And so when you've got something so culturally relevant like Princess Diana passing away in the way that she did, that shares quite a large portion of the calculus that you're really doing, the arithmetic you've got to do to say, well, kind of where is the value distributed here? Is it just because of the virtues of the song itself or the melodies, or is it, this large, substantial section of it that's just culture, that's just momentary, or that's just moods?
And it's not just about culture, it's about personal culture as well. So I've done two things in the past 4 or 5 years where I have essentially gone back to records I loved when I was a kid. So I did a thing where I did all of Pet Sounds, the Beach Boys album, and I did all of it just voice and piano. And I did somewhat more weirdly, more perversely, I did all of Rick Astley's Whenever You Need Somebody, the whole album, just piano and voice. And it was, and the second one obviously was sort of broadly a joke. But the idea really of both of those things was within my own self, they are two of the cornerstones. So the Rick Astley record's the first record I bought with my own money. Pet Sounds is the record that made me want to be a musician. Like, it actually totally set a course for me. And so the idea of reappraising those 30 years later, I found like fascinating. And even though it was interesting from a musical point of view, it's really interesting from a personal point of view of going, oh yeah, I remember how I felt when I heard that record, and now I don't feel that way anymore. So I need to subvert that in some way. Or I feel more like that now than I did. So let's lean on that bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think there is the feelings as well in it. So you can kind of get trapped in the same thing and get this expectation that you should have the same feeling when you hear something at different stages in your life, which is quite perplexing because that can never happen because you change so much. I wonder with the man at the Aerosmith concert, if that feeling is actually migrating to a new one, which is nostalgia rather than, just pure enjoyment in the moment. Aside from that, what would you say to somebody who, I suppose I now feel a little bit skeptical about the songs that I enjoy, and I wonder, I almost feel disheartened by the fact that I could not enjoy the songs because the songs are good, and I enjoy them for other reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of the song. Is there anything you'd say about that?
Well, I don't think it hurts if they're good, if they're really good. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think they may as well be great. But I guess what I'm saying is that, like, I don't know. Like, so for example, you could take one of your songs, okay? And let's imagine that we had like power over time, and we were able to place that song so that it was on Abbey Road, okay? So that for whatever reason, Lennon and McCartney heard it, or that we made sure that they had the idea and they released it. That would be some people's favorite Beatles song. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm not saying you're better than the Beatles, right? But I guess what I'm saying is at that point, they were such a phenomena that people were fascinated by the left and right turns that they were taking. So the actual words, chords, melody is no different in those scenarios. It's no different. But the cultural stuff that surrounds it is totally changed and warped. And I guess my thinking has always been, I've simply got no control over that. I try to have control, and I think that's what playing live is for me, to an extent. It's the only control I have. Because bottom line, if people are having an absolutely banging night, or if they're having a rubbish time in their life and they come to one of my shows and they laugh, or they feel something because one of the songs is kind of the same harmony as they're currently feeling, then essentially I become that. You know, the live show becomes the Princess Diana death, if you will, of that song that they can constantly revisit when they want to feel that way or to show that time has passed since then.
Yeah.
So I always generally think if I've not got any control over that, I may as well just write songs that I think are great.
Yeah. It's doing all you can.
Yeah.
Doing all you can with what you've got. I mean, there's a lot there that's left to look, isn't there? You were saying about like if you were to take any song, really, it is all dependent on factors that go well beyond the song. But as you say, why not make the song as good as it can be to increase your chances of it doing well? You may as well do that.
Yeah.
Let's return to something we skipped a bit over, but I did want to go back to, which was about the function of music. What do you think is the point?
It's a great question. I mean, sometimes I don't know, because it has a different point for me than it does for the people who I want to hear it. Because for me, there's a lot of catharsis. There's a lot of, well, these are a pile of untidy emotions I feel about a particular thing. What a great opportunity for me to tidy them up and make my voice go up and down. Like, it's, that is that's a, personally for me, I love that. In terms of why I listen to music, and I kind of made reference to it when I was talking on the last question, I do think there is a thing of when I feel a certain way, I'm always looking for the song that absolutely nails it, because I feel like there's something about a phase cancellation of those two things that immediately makes me feel A, better, and B, like I'm not the only person in the world who's ever felt it.
Uh-huh.
And so I think that's definitely a function of music that is a particularly important one to me. I made reference to Lullabies for Parents earlier on. That is why I made that record, because I felt things and I could not find music that did the phase cancellation, that made me go, oh, right. Everything I listened to made me lonelier, because all of it was going, oh, it's magical, aren't we all great? So I think that is definitely a function. I think that's one of them. Another one, I think you made reference to nostalgia. I think music plays a huge role in my friendships, where you kind of go, okay, well, me and that person were really close at that time. And when we were, that's the thing, that's the music that's our music. And it will always take me back to that, But there are other functions in terms of just like, one of the things I adore, in fact, it only happened last night, was I had some music on in the garden and my daughter was just dancing. She didn't know it, so she's not got any context for it. But there's just a physical response to music, not my music. Other than like getting up and leaving, but like it's not like I make music specifically to be danced to. That's just kind of not my thing. But there's that function as well. So I guess it has many functions for the wider world.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a physiological thing there anyway for anything, even your music, Rick.
Even my music.
But it does. You can't help. I mentioned earlier on about what I look at when I'm playing live, and it's people's eyes and how quiet they are. And that's the sort of physiological cues that I'm looking for to say I'm doing a good job. I know they're looking at me, or they're looking and staring at something. Like there's a kind of dull focus on whatever's in front of them, and they're quiet. And there's a tension in the room that you can just feel.
They might be dead. Is there a chance they're dead? Everything you've said could just be people who've just died.
I mean, there's always that chance. I never discount it entirely. Okay, function of music then. I mean, I agree. I never even, it's one of those things where I trying to develop this skill of being able to talk about music and ask questions like, what's it for? Because we sometimes just take those things for granted entirely, and you don't have to know. Nobody has to know why they can't help but stand up and dance to music when it's playing. You just can't help yourself. But I kind of developing that skill is my way of being able to look at it and understand it. I mean, I was quite surprised when I started this podcast that nobody else was already doing it, or asking the sort of questions that I wanted to ask about creativity, because I think for so many people, it's just a given. It's just obvious. It's self-evident. It just is what it is, and it needs no other justification at all.
Well, I also think there is a real misnomer about how things are created, and I do think the sort of, the non-musicians I know, the civilians, shall I say, very much kind of in this sense that like there's lightning that hits the top of my head and then I have a song. And the idea of an idea being worked is just not something. I think that's something that is a misnomer that's given over by a lot of the media as well, isn't it? You see those awful montages of, when the band wrote that famous song. And it's like, it's always useless. It's always like, well, clearly that's not what happened. Because it's years of work,
I was going to ask, do you think you have much of a choice in what you do, then in that case, if it is like there's this physiological thing of responding to sounds, I mean, I don't really feel like I have any choice about writing music. It just kind of plagues me. Otherwise, if I'm not doing something with it, I'm just stuck with it until I literally do something with it. It's just gonna kind of haunt me.
I think there's definitely a part of that. I don't necessarily think I look at it as quite as negatively as that. And I would say that I am probably at my most mentally healthy when I am in the back of my mind trying to solve a little musical problem. And I think that my happiest times, if I were to kind of have to list them, are probably music or music related. And so, yeah, I think why we do it becomes a very complicated question. Especially when you reach my age, because it's not like I'm going to get a record deal. Like, I think that's what a lot of people think. It's like, do you think you're going to make it? It's like, well, I mean, what does that even mean? Like, it doesn't really mean anything.
Aerosmith.
Aerosmith, mate. Exactly. Mm-hmm. It's clearly what it is. But, so I think I do it. I think at the end, I love the craft. Yeah. And I love gigging. Like, I properly love it. I don't know many people who love music as much as me. I know lots of people who are better at it than me. I don't think I know anyone who gets as much of a kick out of it as I do. And I think it's an opportunity to perform, and I love to perform. Not in a kind of look at me kind of way. I just love the variables that come with it. It's the best night out. Like, it's really good fun. Like, I love getting laughs. I'm a total ham. I'm a big fan of kind of being able to do that emotional thing. And you do kind of go, I think it is like, I had a bit of a weird experience last summer, which meant I kind of stopped gigging for a little bit. Not long, it was just longer than normal, a couple of months. And then I kind of went, right, I've got to see whether the well's dry, not in terms of whether I've got no more ideas, but just whether I can even be asked, So I did a show that was like an all-request show because I was kind of a bit sick of everything being filtered through my own brain. So I did an all-request show where basically I said, right, email me or message me or whatever. Tell me what you want me to play, and I'll play it. And so a lot of it was my songs, a lot of it was some covers. Some of them were ridiculous. And I did the show, and it was great. I mean, it was great fun, and I think it helped because the audience obviously were really involved because they kind of wrote stuff. And there were about 40 or 50 people there. And I kind of finished and went, I loved every moment of that.
Yeah.
And it's a high wire act. Just me and a piano and a couple of beers, and you've really made something that is a proper shared experience for everyone for 2 hours. And that's great. That's a really good thing to be able to do. Like, I'm incredibly privileged to be able to do that, So yeah, I think, and then at the same time, I wouldn't be asked performing if I wasn't writing new stuff. So they become this kind of like cycle, where good shows beget new songs, beget better shows, etc. And on it goes.
Yeah, it keeps moving. I mean, again, I already mentioned that I like some of the words you've used to describe these things, but I do think of it as problem solving. And a few people I've spoken to on the podcast do think of it with that. I mean, I think I must have removed myself from really working on music and pushing music for the best part of about 5 years, at some point after college and after working in the music industry for a while. Quite a long break before I did that again. Part of what led me to doing the things I do now with philosophy and with this podcast is that I just took problem solving somewhere else. And so I was applying the same skills, like in philosophy is a good example of that. Exactly the same skills of like, this is a problem, let's solve it. How can I do that? And just applying it. I think the difference with music, especially in your case, is that there's a higher risk involved because you're in front of other people. So you've got to solve that problem in real time.
Yeah, I suppose it's that. I mean, when
added pressure.
Well, let me ask you a question. When you weren't fully concentrating on music, did you like properly flick the switch? Did you go, I just don't have those thoughts anymore? And then when you started again, you then flicked that switch again? Or were you always thought of writing, but just not actively front office kind of thing?
It was like a flat tire for me. I think that was the difference. Whereas I'd spent most of my life with music, at least. I mean, I was very late to it. I don't think I picked up an instrument at all until I was about 15 or something like that. And it always felt like a fully inflated tire that just kept moving. So ideas kept coming, and they were always new. They were always interesting. Probably because I was more of a scatterbrain and a bit all over the place, and I like new ideas. So I was always looking for it. So it meant the ideas kept coming. But as I've got older, I've tried to deal with some of those things from my youth, because it's not very healthy to be all over the place all of the time. And that is what I was like. So in doing that, I feel like the cost was being so creative all of the time and constantly having new ideas. So that kind of softened, and I think I was fairly beaten up after working in the music industry for quite a long while and doing it for the wrong.
It's the worst.
Reasons. Yeah. I was doing it for fairly mercenary reasons as well. So it became a little bit too focused on the money and the wage that I was getting, which is not really the right reason to do anything in the arts, I don't think. But for me, just that dampened, and kind of, I felt like ideas for a long period of time, ideas still came every now and again. It was very infrequent, and they were a lot, maybe I'm tempted to use the word like softer, but I just mean like a deflated tire.
Mm-hmm.
It was harder to get to them. I couldn't see the ideas as clearly. They were muffled almost.
And when you went, right, I'm going to do something with these ideas, like, were you scared? Like, were you afraid of going, I might just not be able to? Like, the tire might be gone.
I don't think I was. I think one of the prompts was, at some point I had some kind of personal stuff in my life, and so I think it was the emotions that just carried me through back into it, and they were enough to lift me back into being creative. And this is what really was the beginning of Arthur Dove, because I remember having about a month-long period where I just could not stop. It was just every day there was a new song, and they were good. It was good stuff, and like 3 of them I released.
They're great days. Yeah.
And it was just every day for about a month. It was just, I was doing more. I was recording them just on GarageBand with me singing ideas literally into the iPad, and just programming, tapping things in. I couldn't play piano at all at the time, so I didn't really know what I was doing. But it was just a very intense, probably because I was more emotional, but a very intense period where I just churned them out. And after that month, it just kind of slowed down. And so my attitude towards creation changed a little bit. And I think now is like, well, I'll just dig where the potatoes are. And when I'm feeling creative, that's when I'll create. And I'll push it a little bit here and there. I'll go and sit at the piano, or I'll go play the guitar. I'll try and do some things, but I don't force it as much. And I feel like I've got a better relationship with it now. It just seems to come naturally, and I can expand on it.
That's healthy. I always think there's a good thing about what you're talking about there, is you just had some amazing lock-ins in the green room, basically. Yeah?
Yeah.
You just had this amazing period. But I tend to think, I hear a lot of writers say, oh, I'm not really feeling it today. And you just go, look, there's plenty to be doing in the red room. Just because the green room isn't giving you all the magic, there's always things you can be doing in the red room. Like for me, on my phone, I've got like a voice notes thing, and it's just rammed with stuff, bits of piano, bits of me singing. And sometimes I'll just literally go, and then just pick one and go, right, for whatever reason, this interested me enough to want to record it in the first place. So I'm going to spend half an hour shaping whatever this is. And I'll kind of have that conversation with myself before I've even pressed play, before I know what it is, you know. And then you kind of go, right, and that is entirely Red Room stuff. I don't have to feel it to do that. It's admin, you know. It's not, you know, I'm not exactly praying for the muse, you know. Ultimately, if I've got a line, I've got to find something that rhymes with it. There it is. Yeah. You know.
No, I think that's exactly it. I have spoken about it before and thought about moving either like longitudinal or lateral. And so when I'm doing something like longitudinal, it means that I'm kind of using that left hemisphere and I'm thinking through and kind of, it's a continuation of something I've already started. Whereas a lateral move in your analogy would be moving from green room to a different green room.
Yeah.
Almost. And so that's like me going, I'm still creating and I'm still using that same spirit, but I'm moving from music to
or from one song to another, or from music to philosophy, or to tea. So there's kind of like a shift in different. I can go either left or right or up and down. That's kind of how I think that's how I look at it now, and the balance just seems a little bit healthier because I don't get so frustrated when I'm stuck in, let's say, one room. I don't feel like that's the only way I could go. I think I could just go into that red room or this other green room. Like, I've got choice. I just go do that.
I also think it's a percentages game. And if you've only ever, if you've written 2 songs ever, and then you write a third one that's not very good, then percentage-wise, you are not a very good songwriter. Do you know what I mean? Just every song just means more because it takes up a bigger percentage of your catalogue of work. Whereas because I've just written for so long, it doesn't hurt me at all if I write a shit song. Like, I'm very happy to. Some of my favourite songs are terrible that I've written. Like, but not terrible, but just like I clearly, there's just nothing quite there.
I'm going to quote that later, by the way.
Good. I'm not that terrible. But they've always just essentially given me, they've just been going to the gym. They've just been working muscles. That means that when I do get an idea that at its heart is simply better, then that song has helped me solve those problems.
Yeah, I've had, especially in that period that I was just talking about, but I've had it, I kind of started writing again quite a lot in the lockdown because I had time to spare, so I may as well. But I find that, that the muscle analogy works because I'll end up kind of beefing up. Almost it's like the same idea that I've expressed in 10 different ways. You can tell it's the same idea. And eventually I kind of go, hang on, this part in this song is really quite similar to this part in this song and this one. But the chorus from this song works in it, and they end up being amalgamated into this, like this alloy of all of the best, these composite parts of all of the best bits. But that's just part of the process. And I don't think people... I know when I was younger, didn't really appreciate that was what the process was. Because as you say, it's always spelled out in the media as if it's this simple start to finish, one direct line where it's more like a zigzag from sideways, like longitude to latitude, to green room to red room. You're a bit all over the place. And I think you just got to, I mean, is that a skill in itself? Like tuning in to know when to make that change?
Yes. I mean, that is the biggie. And I think that is the place where being older is really helpful. Because I think you just know yourself better. You know yourself. I mean, I'm older than you, but you know yourself 5 years ago, you just were not as attuned to your own emotional needs as you are now. And I think that I think also having kids really changed things in terms of time. Because I think I really struggle when I've got complete freedom of time. Whereas if I've got an hour, I can essentially go, right, I'm going to have an hour of green room. Go. Or I'll go, right, I'm on the train for 25 minutes. And I've got to finish this second verse. That's purely a red room problem. But again, these things are born out of having less time. If I had infinite time, I think I'd really struggle. I have before, where you kind of go, right, I've got a week to write some songs. It's like nothing done. Like it's work.
I simulate pressure now by putting everything on calendars and to-do lists. And if it's on a certain list, then I don't know, I can't get past the fact that it needs to be done, and I get frustrated and annoyed if I don't do that thing.
Yeah, that's the role gigs have for me. That's where I like to always have 2 or 3 a month, because essentially I'll kind of go, well, this is 75% done. Do you know what? I'm going to push through at 25%, even if it's not very good, just so I can road test it, just so I can play it. And then it might be that then I change it again, you know. But like, it's a thing that forces me to get to it to that 100% mark.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I genuinely could go on forever and ever, but I'm very conscious of
we got
your
songs
time
to write
as well.
We got songs to write.
We do indeed, yeah. So let's leave it there. This has been absolutely joyous. Where's the best place to find everything there is to know about Ric Neale?
Well, the first thing you could do is try and spell it right, which is Ric Neale, Ricneale. And if you go to ricneale.com, there's lots of information there. But all of my music is on Spotify. So just search me there, add me to playlists. If you like it, send it to friends.
And you have your own podcast as well. I was listening to that this morning.
Yeah, I do. It's very sort of sporadic. I found that I kind of try and, even though I haven't got a massive audience, I do all right, but it's not massive. I kind of try and treat my audience the way I would like to be treated. And if the songwriters I love did an 1.5 hour long podcast about how they wrote one rhyming couplet, I would eat it up. Like, I would love it. I'm a proper process junkie. So I kind of did it for the few fans of mine that are really into that kind of stuff. But also, I think it helps me have to verbalize my process, and in so doing makes me have to address it.
Yeah, you get a better sense of knowledge, I suppose, about what you're actually doing. I mean, this is partly why I do this podcast. I've got a friend, Liam, who writes under the name Woes and Wonder. So that was the first podcast, actually.
Yeah, I listened to that one.
So Liam, same kind of thing in that regard, I think. But let's leave it there. This was, it was really brilliant. So thank you for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.